It took me a long time to get my driver's license. I was a bit of a nervous driver, but when I finally got my N, when I could finally drive by myself, the first place I wanted to go was, of course, Starbucks. And because this was a celebration of my first time driving alone, I had to go through the drive-thru. I had never driven through a drive-thru before, but I wanted to try. So I pull up, I order my double, tall, blonde, half-sweet vanilla oat latte. And as I was driving up to the window to pay, I noticed that I was really far away from the window, almost to the point where I couldn't really reach to pay. And there was no one behind me in line, so I decided to reverse and see if I could pull in closer. But because I was a bit of a new driver and because I was still learning, I ended up pulling in very close to the window. In fact, I was so close that the whole front part of my car was pretty much right up against that brick wall. And this is where I started to get nervous, because at this point, 2 cars had come in through the drive-thru, and I knew that my drink was going to be ready any minute, so the pressure was on. So once again, I tried to readjust, but this time I ended up so close to the brick wall that my side mirror is now pushed and scraped up against the wall. And at this point, I didn't know what to do. I felt like no matter how I moved my car, I was going to lose my side mirror. I was stuck, and so was my car. And I'm starting to panic. The Starbucks barista was trying to tell me how to move my steering wheel, but I wasn't really listening. I was so scared and I was so embarrassed that I just froze. And the way that this story ends is that a man who was in one of the cars behind me in the drive-thru got out of his car and he came to help me. I had to climb up out of my car through the passenger seat, and he had to climb in through the passenger seat. And of course, he had to readjust the driver's seat all the way back because he was so tall, as I just stood there helplessly outside in front of multiple cars. And he got my car unstuck from the Starbucks drive-thru, and my mirror was intact. And this is probably one of the most embarrassing things that has ever happened to me. No one likes to get stuck, and I think we can all agree that it is an awful feeling. Over the past few weeks, we have been going through a series called Stuck, where we've been talking about different ways that you and I can get stuck in our lives and how we can get unstuck. And so far, we've talked about what to do when we feel stuck in our faith, when we feel stuck with no purpose. We've talked about isolation, when you feel stuck and alone. And today, we are going to conclude the series, and we're going to be talking about when we feel stuck in a rut of burnout and exhaustion. And just so we are all on the same page, what do I mean when I say stuck in a rut? Well, a rut is a long and deep passage in the ground made by the repeated passage of vehicle wheels, kind of like an indent in the mud caused by a car tire. And when someone is referring to being stuck in a rut, they're typically talking about being stuck in the same actions, habits, addictive behaviors, thoughts, again and again and again, and they're unable to break free from the cycle. Being stuck in a rut can be used to describe almost anything, from something simple to being stuck in a rut like your eating habits. So for example, maybe you just keep having to stop at Dairy Queen on the way home from work, to bigger and more complicated things. That you can actually be stuck in a rut mentally and be stuck in burnout. What is burnout? Burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion that is caused by excessive and prolonged stress. Let me read it again. Burnout is a state, it's a mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion, and it is caused by excessive and prolonged stress. And this is something that goes so much deeper than forgetting your Sunday afternoon nap. This is a deep exhaustion that impacts every area of your life. And someone who's feeling burnt out may feel a lack of motivation. Maybe they're constantly exhausted. They might feel hopeless and alone, cynical. They might feel a lack of joy. Maybe they're irritable and impatient. The things that they once loved now feel like a burden. They might even feel stuck. And burnout is not an uncommon feeling. A recent study found that 38% of Canadians feel burnt out as a result of the work demands. And the statistics just get higher and higher depending on your occupation. In fact, in recent years, burnout rates have risen so fast that in 2019, the World Health Organization has deemed burnout an occupational phenomenon. And this is just talking about work. Forget about your family or friends, social pressure, paying bills, social media, personal health concerns, kids, aging parents. There's so many things to do in life. And on top of that, we live in this culture that celebrates and glorifies working hard and being busy. Maybe you've heard of God helps those who helps themselves. You might have heard of hustle culture. We all want to be self-made. The more that we take on, the more we do, the more that we serve, the more celebrated and applauded we are. And it is such a great feeling when life is busy, but we're killing it. We're doing great. We're balancing everything. We can do it all. But what happens when we find ourselves in those moments of our lives where we're not doing so great? When you go to bed tired and you wake up tired. When your to-do list is piling up, but you don't even think you can get out of bed. When you've hit a wall. Have you ever felt like that? If you have, you're not alone. I have. And so what do we do when we're stuck in that place? When we're stuck in that rut of burnout and exhaustion? When life demands so much from us, but we don't always have enough to give? And today we're going to look at a story from the Bible about a man who was stuck in a rut. He was exhausted physically, emotionally, and mentally. This man had kept going and going and going, and eventually he found himself in a place where he was stuck. Some of you may have heard of Elijah. We see much of his story in 1st and 2nd Kings, and if you have read about him, his life is crazy. There was no question that God used Elijah in mighty ways. Among just a few things, he was supernaturally fed by God in the wilderness. He raised the dead. He was literally carried away into heaven by a whirlwind. And one of the major moments in Elijah's life is found in 1 Kings 18. At this time, Israel was being ruled by King Ahab, and the Bible tells us that Ahab was the worst of all of Israel's kings. He married Jezebel, and she was a foreigner, and under their influence together, they led the people of Israel's hearts away from the Lord through idol worship. And in 1 Kings 18, Elijah has had enough of this idol worship. He confronts King Ahab. He summons all of Israel together, and he gathers all the prophets of Baal, the prophets of this false god, 850 of them to be exact. And he challenged these prophets of Baal to a big showdown, to this giant Super Bowl. It's their team against Elijah's team. And basically Elijah says, hey, let's determine once and for all whose God is the one true God. He said to the prophets of Baal, if your God is real, then let him prove it. Let him send down fire from heaven. But if my God is real, he will send down fire from heaven. And so these false prophets, they try and they try and they try, but nothing happens. No fire comes down from heaven. But Elijah, he prays to God, and fire falls from heaven, proving that Yahweh, his God, is the one true God. He's won his battle. The people finally see that Baal is not the true God, and Elijah executes all the false prophets. Boom, it's done. It's quite the scene, and you can imagine the boldness and the fearlessness of this man, Elijah. But after this big showdown, King Ahab, he goes home at the end of the day, and he tells his wife Jezebel all that has happened. And in response, Jezebel decides to send Elijah a message saying, I know what you did, and I'm going to kill you. And suddenly, a couple of days after this great and overwhelming victory, just a couple days after Elijah has literally called down fire from heaven and defeated hundreds of false prophets, Elijah is undone by this threat from Jezebel. He's so scared that the Bible tells us he literally runs for his life. In fact, Elijah runs about as far away as he possibly could, almost 160 kilometers away, into a place called Beersheba. And at this point, he is exhausted. He has physically run himself into the ground. And this is where we come in at 1 Kings 19, verse 4. It says, he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and he prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Elijah, he's alone. He's afraid. It sounds like he's struggling with depression. He's physically and mentally and emotionally exhausted. Elijah is stuck. He's stuck in burnout. So stuck, in fact, that he has given up. He's done. But the great thing about this story is that it doesn't end there. That God doesn't leave Elijah stuck in burnout and exhaustion. That God doesn't see the situation the same way that Elijah sees it. That God actually sees a hope and a future that Elijah was unable to see in that moment. And some of you are watching today and you may feel like Elijah. Some of you may think that the only way through the pain is to end the pain, and you may be struggling with thoughts on ending your life. And if that's you today, I want to encourage you, first of all, to talk to someone about how you're feeling. You can reach out to one of our pastors here or to someone trusted in your life. But secondly, in this story, we can see that there is hope beyond what we're going through, hope beyond burnout, hope beyond our hopelessness. In this story, we see that God was actively and intentionally involved in every single detail of Elijah's recovery. We see that God helps Elijah get unstuck just like he wants to help you get unstuck. I believe that the story of Elijah is something that you and I can look to as a practical guide, not only to prevent burnout, but also to help us when we find ourselves stuck in burnout. So let's look at this story together. The first thing that Elijah needed to get unstuck was Elijah needed rest. Verse 5 says, "Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, 'Get up and eat.' He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and then he laid down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, 'Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you.'" Elijah, he's exhausted. He's burnt out and he has had enough. But God's great cure for Elijah is not to do some crazy spiritual fasts or to tell him to pray harder or to condemn him for not being a good enough Christian or not having enough faith. No. God's great solution for Elijah is to rest. God sends him an angel to bring him bread and water to eat, and then he takes a nap and he eats again. When you're stuck in a rut, when you're stuck in burnout, often the first step to getting better is simply to rest. Sometimes the most spiritual thing that you can do is to have a nap. Rest is not only a gift from God, but it is a command from God. It's something that God has literally woven into creation. We can see it in the Genesis account, that in the beginning, when God created the world, he himself rested on the seventh day of creation. As an example for you and I, it says in Genesis 2:2, "By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all of his work." Are you stuck in a rut of exhaustion and burnout? The start to the solution may not be as complicated as you think. Some questions that you can ask yourself are you getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep at night? Are you working out? Are you eating properly? Are you seeing your doctor regularly? Are you taking a weekly rest day? Or are you filling your rest day with errands and running around and allowing things from your work to spill over into it? For the nation of Israel, God put something called Sabbath in their law as a part of their weekly lives. And if you're unfamiliar with Sabbath, it's one day during the week where we pause, where we don't work. It's a day of rest. And we don't follow the Sabbath law, but we still follow the Sabbath principle to this very day. We follow the principle of taking one day a week to rest. The Hebrew word for Sabbath literally means to stop, but it can also be translated as to delight. And that's what the Sabbath is. That's what a day of rest is. It is a time to stop and delight in God and all that he's given us. When we aren't resting, we miss this opportunity to reconnect and be refilled and refueled by God. Not resting our bodies physically always seeps into other areas of our lives because our physical and our mental health are connected. Not resting our bodies physically has lasting effects on our mental and emotional health. Are you feeling stuck in burnout? The first step to getting unstuck is rest. The next thing that Elijah needed when he was stuck is that Elijah needed a reset. You know when your internet isn't working and you call Bell, you call Rogers, and the first thing that they usually tell you to do is to reset your router. That's kind of what Elijah needed, but he needed a reset in his thinking. As we continue on reading the story, we see that God sends Elijah on this 40-day journey to Mount Sinai. This was known as the mountain of the Lord. This was where God's people would go to meet with him. And this is actually the mountain where God first revealed himself to Moses, to the Israelites. This is the mountain where God gave them the 10 Commandments. And God brings Elijah all the way here and asks him one question. He asks in verse 9, Elijah, what are you doing here? In other words, Elijah, what is going on? And he replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. We see here that Elijah is pouring out his heart to God. And in response, God does something pretty interesting. He says in verse 11, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. And scripture tells us that first God sends this powerful wind that sweeps through the mountains. Then he sends this giant earthquake. And then God sends down fire. But after the wind, after the earthquake, and after the fire comes a gentle whisper. And this gentle whisper captures Elijah's attention. This is such a beautiful picture of God showing Elijah that even if Elijah feels like everything is falling apart, that God is still in control, that he's all powerful and all present, and that he knows what he's doing. And so once again, God asks Elijah the very same question. He says, what are you doing here, Elijah? But this time, God has his attention. But again, Elijah gives him the same response as he did earlier. And this gives us a bit of an insight into what is going on inside of Elijah's head. It shows us where his thinking has gone wrong. It shows us that he is stuck in a rut in his mind, that he is stuck in his thinking, and that he needs a reset. There have been a few times when I have needed to talk about something. In other words, when I have been upset about something. And sometimes when this happens, I find myself in Pastor Andy's office. He's the director of discipleship here at Broadway. And I start to tell him all that has happened. And he listens to me because he's kind. But usually at the end of my dramatic story, Pastor Andy will say something like, Des, thanks for sharing. But do you think that's true? Or do you think that's a story that you've been telling yourself? And can I just say for the record that the last thing that you want to hear when you're upset about something is someone saying, is that a story that you're telling yourself? So don't go talk to Pastor Andy if you're upset about something. But Pastor Andy was right. I had been telling myself a story. Sometimes we can see and hear something, and then we can tell ourselves a story about what we see and what we hear without fully knowing the context or the history, without fully understanding. And because of this story that we start to tell ourselves, we experience emotions which lead us to actions, whether the story we've told ourselves is true or not. So for example, maybe you see someone giving you a dirty look, and the story that you tell yourself is that they are mad at you, which makes you mad at them, so you decide to ignore them. But the real story here is that the sun was just in their eyes. That person had told themselves a story that was not true. They experienced emotions based off of something that was not true, and that led them to negative actions. And Elijah, he has told himself a story. The story he has told himself is that he claims that he is the only one left in the whole world who is still serving God. But that's not true at all. We see just a few verses down that God tells him that there are 7,000 others just like Elijah. Another story that he told himself was that because things didn't work out the way he thought they would, that all of his work was in vain, that it meant nothing, and that he had failed. But again, this is not a true story. This was a story that he had been telling himself. And because of these stories that Elijah has been telling himself, because of this poor thinking, it has impacted his heart. And he is disappointed. He's angry. He's bitter and sad. He's frustrated. In order for Elijah to move forward and heal from burnout, to get out of this mental rut, he needs to deal with his thoughts. And in fact, if he doesn't deal with those stories that he's telling himself, he's going to end up right back where he started in the first place. Elijah needed a reset. Philippians 4:8 says, "Fix your eyes on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about the things that are excellent and worthy of praise." Are you stuck in a rut mentally? Are you stuck in burnout? The path forward begins in your thoughts. We need to make sure that our thoughts are lining up with God's thoughts. We need to focus on what is true and right and lovely. And just like Elijah, when we are telling ourselves a story, we need to make sure that we are testing our thoughts. We need to take inventory of what's going on in our minds. The hurt, the bitterness, the anger that you've been feeling. Is it possible that you've been telling yourself a story? Have you been making assumptions about a situation or a person? Often, when we're stuck in burnout, we need a reset in our minds before we can continue to move forward. So Elijah, to get unstuck, he needed rest. He needed a reset. And the third thing that Elijah needed to get unstuck from burnout was that Elijah needed to refocus. It's pretty clear that Elijah was so caught up in his problem with Jezebel that he lost focus of the bigger picture of what God was calling him to do. And in verse 15, this is what God says to him. "Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. And when you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. And also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Maholah to succeed you as a prophet." And what we see happening here is that God is giving Elijah a new mission. He sends him to anoint the new king of Israel, which is pretty cool. And then God also sends him to anoint and mentor his successor, whose name is Elisha. Not confusing at all. Elijah needed to take his focus off of what he was so upset about and refocus on the new things that God was calling him to do. He needed to refocus on the world around him, refocus on helping others and investing in others. Often when we're stuck in a rut, we can be so focused on ourselves that we can have tunnel vision. But sometimes we just need a perspective shift. We need to take a look around. Now ask yourself, what is God calling me to do in the season? God has not called you to do everything and be everything to everyone. Maybe that's the reason you found yourself in burnout in the first place. Why don't you try to narrow it down to 3 things? What is God really calling you to do in the season? You can ask yourself, is God calling me to do something new? Is there somewhere that God is calling me to serve? Because often the best thing that we can do when we're stuck in burnout and exhaustion is refocus on the world around us and what God has called us to do. When I started going to college full-time, I had 2 jobs to help me pay for life. I was working at a church part-time, leading the young adults, and I was also working at London Drugs as a pharmacy assistant 4 days a week. And at first glance, that kind of seems manageable. I mean, I thought it was. But then life happened. There was a lot of staff turnover at my church. The person who was in charge was going through a bit of a hard time, and he was kind of MIA. I didn't really know how to say no, and as a result, much of that workload ended up landing on me. And for some reason, I felt personally responsible to make sure that everything got done. I felt like if I didn't do it, who would? And at first, it was no problem. I really could do everything. And when work got too much, I just did it on my days off. And if I had a paper due, if it was exam season, no problem. I would just pull an all-nighter. Who needs to sleep? Not me. I went for almost a year of staying at work until 11 or 12 at night because there was so much to be done. And then I would go home and I would start working on my homework. I wasn't resting. I was not taking days off. I was sleeping maybe 2 or 3 hours a night, or sometimes not even at all, and I was too scared to say anything. So I ignored how I felt and I kept going and going and going until suddenly I couldn't go anymore. I didn't see it coming, but one day I woke up and I hit a wall. I physically could not get out of bed. No matter how much I slept, I was exhausted, and I went to see a doctor. I was diagnosed with occupational burnout, and my body, under the stress and pressure of everything that had been going on, I actually developed an autoimmune disease. For 4 to 5 months, the only thing I could do was go to work at London Drugs, and then I would come home and go to bed. I couldn't hang out with anyone. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even talk to the cashier at Save On. I didn't want to work in a church anymore. I was mad at God. I was so broken and angry and hurt. It was one of the lowest moments of my adult life. But friends, in this time, I wasn't resting. I was not taking care of my body. I was not dealing with and resetting my thoughts. The stories that I was telling myself were that if I didn't do everything, it would all fall apart. That if I quit, I would be a bad leader. Leaders don't quit. That I couldn't tell anyone what was going on. And I was not focusing on what God had called me to do. I was actually focusing on everything. And the result? I was stuck in a rut of burnout and exhaustion, and I did not know how to get out. When we are stuck in burnout, it means that we are not living the way that God has designed us to live. It's this warning sign going off like the ones in your car saying something is wrong here. And sometimes when we are stuck in that place, we need to take that step like I did to fix some of the imbalances in our lives, to go to the doctor, to make sure that we aren't overloading our schedules, to set some boundaries. But for our weary hearts, the solution is not turning to a thing or trying harder or doing less. The solution is coming back to a person. It's coming back to Jesus, the only one who can truly get us unstuck, out of our rut and out of our burnouts. And that brings me to my big idea for today, which is healing from burnout is not merely about doing less, but allowing Jesus to do more. And what do I mean by that? One of my favorite verses is found in Matthew 11:28-30. I love the Message translation. This is what it says. It says, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and I'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." And I love this because it is a beautiful picture and promise of deep and real rest and restoration for our weary hearts. But if you notice, Jesus says, "I will show you how to rest. Watch me work. Watch how I do it. I will teach you. I won't lay anything heavy on you. The burden that I give you is light." Jesus wants to do the heavy lifting in your life. He wants to carry your burdens, your heaviness, your brokenness, your problems. He wants to be the one who teaches you to rest and reset and refocus. There's an invitation here, but the condition is that you must accept the invitation. Because healing from burnout is not merely about doing less, but allowing Jesus to do more. Going on a vacation to Mexico, going to the spa, binge watching a whole season of Love is Blind. Sure, maybe that will make you feel better for a few moments. You'll feel rested. But none of that provides the real solution for a weary and burnt out soul. The invitation is come to me or get away with me. And it's for all of us. Are you tired? Come to me. Are you worn out? Come to me. Are you burdened? Come to me. Let's pray. Maybe you're listening today and it feels like I'm talking to you. Maybe you're listening and you feel stuck in exhaustion. Maybe you feel overwhelmed by the weight of life. And maybe you're listening today and you've never actually taken that step to accept Jesus into your heart and into your life and to carry those burdens. Friends, like I said, the invitation is there, but you have to accept it. So if that's you today, I'm going to pray for you. You can just agree with me as I pray. So God, I come to you and I give all of my burdens to you and I invite you into everything. I feel stuck under the weight of everything that's going on in my life. And I acknowledge that you are the only one who can help me get unstuck. God, help me come to you in every single area of my life and help me take the next steps to get better and to get out of this rut. God, I invite you into my situation, into my heart, and into my life. I trust you, and I give everything to you. In Jesus' name, amen. And if that's you today, if you prayed that prayer with me, if you gave your heart and your life to Jesus, I would love to encourage you to text the number on the screen. One of our pastors would love to connect with you, would love to pray with you. Thank you for joining us today.